Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's nonprofit podcast. Our topic today is succession planning, preparing for the future. My name is Jason Q. I'm a managing attorney at the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. Our mission is to provide pro bono legal assistance to nonprofit organizations in Washington, DC. Today's podcast is part of a series organized by the Pro Bono Center and the Center for Nonprofit Advancement, focusing on practical challenges that nonprofits face on a regular basis. On our website, you can find webinars, newsletters, legal alerts, and other resources covering a wide range of nonprofit legal issues. That website address is www.lawhelp.org/DC/CED. I'm joined today on our podcast by Barbara Kavanaugh. Barbara has experience as a nonprofit manager, executive director, board member, interim chief of operations, and interim executive director. She has both experienced and managed nonprofit leadership transitions. So she's a great speaker to have with me today on our podcast about succession planning. Hi, Barbara. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Jason. I'm happy to.
Okay, fantastic. And Barbara, you're part of an organization called the Interim Executive Network, and I know that the network is interested in particular in this topic of succession planning. Can you tell us a little bit about the network and why succession planning has become a focus area?
Yeah, the Interim Executive Network is a professional network of probably around 18 to 20 professional interim executive directors. That means our job is to fill in when a nonprofit is going through a leadership transition. It's different than acting. We bring more value added, and we are professional interims, so it's not a rent to own. It's not, try us out and then you can hire us full time. We actually choose to work specifically with nonprofits in transition.
Got it.
And
so that makes sense for why. Sorry. So that makes it clear why succession planning is such an important part of what the network does, and what the network is interested in. Because whether or not an organization has a succession plan in place probably really affects what the environment looks like when you step into an organization.
Exactly. We really believe that transition can be a really exciting time for an organization to re-examine its direction, to recommit to its mission, or to make the big decisions that can really control the next iteration of the organization. And that as interims, we're there to help give the board and staff the time and space to have those important conversations and make decisions. However, we also find that a lot of organizations don't plan for change by putting in place a succession plan. And it's odd to me that most boards will spend a lot of time and energy in developing a strategic plan, but yet don't put the succession plan next to it to ensure the sustainability of the organization through that plan, regardless of any transitions that happen.
And do you have any idea why that might be? Why organizations will focus on strategic planning, but then not focus as much as on succession planning, on leadership transitions?
Yeah, I really can. I mean, there was a study almost 10 years ago, but by BoardSource, and it said only 27% of the organizations surveyed had a succession plan. I think that it may be because, funders often now require strategic plans, and I think that they have become part of the expected kind of vernacular in nonprofit, but funders are not necessarily requiring the succession planning, and so people don't necessarily expect to see it and see it as an obligation, especially the board. It's part of their fiduciary obligation to protect the ongoing sustainability of an organization. And certainly a strategic plan addresses that, but a succession plan is an important part of that as well.
And I wonder if there's just some maybe sensitivity or awkwardness about talking about what the organization is going to look like after the current executive director leaves. Maybe some boards and organizations want to cross that bridge when they get there. They don't want to,
Yeah.
while the executive director is still serving, they don't want to look like they're thinking too far ahead or, thinking about, well, what happens when this person is gone? Maybe they don't want to give the impression that they want the executive director to leave.
Yeah.
And they're
Right.
afraid of giving that impression by being more proactive.
Yeah, that I think that is a part of it, and I think going back to interim executive leadership, that's one of
Mm-hmm.
the things that we do when we come into an organization after the departing CEO. Because we don't have that we bring a certain objectivity with us, and we're not looking for the long time position. We
Mm-hmm.
give the board the opportunity to really, in a very, very safe and objective way, think about some of those more difficult questions, whether it be re-examining mission, looking for a new kind or type of leader, or sometimes even thinking about merger or dissolution. Those conversations are difficult to have when a
Right.
CEO is in place, and are doubly difficult to have when the board is responding to a crisis, and feel like they don't have time for that kind of mindful planning. The interim director gives them that time.
Well, let's talk about the interim directors in a moment, but why don't we step back and let's maybe define what we're talking about when we talk about succession planning and a succession plan. How do you think
Okay.
about these? Yeah.
Well, I think a succession plan is really, and as attorneys, we're used to the notion of it's a risk management tool.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a change in leadership, you want to make sure that the organization has everything in place to continue operating. Often, when there's a transition, a long tenured leader takes a lot of information with her about relationships or kind of the nuts and bolts of the organization that people don't necessarily think about. For an example, a succession plan might have an analysis of the executive director's role as a external spokesperson, as a policy expert, as a relationship maintenance, and you can identify those functions and then assign them either by title or individual in the event of that executive director's departure, whether temporarily or permanently. You also might want to have a media or communications plan to make sure that when there is a change, everyone knows who the go-to person is, who manages that message. So you're not sending out mixed messages or unclear messages to donors and supporters. Something as simple as who are the signatories of our accounts? What are our recurring payments? What are our passwords? These are often things that you just need to take the moment to write them down to ensure that the organization continues its business. And then, finally, it's a time when you're writing the plan to really think through, will we take advantage of interim leadership? Are we growing internal leaders that can step up? It's a time for the board to think about those larger issues as well.
Got it. Well, and yeah, I'm curious about that last point. So in folks' succession plans, will sometimes organizations kind of affirmatively decide, yeah, we want to bring in an interim executive director as we maybe do a search for a permanent director, or do some organizations kind of start the process of thinking about who the next permanent executive director is during the succession planning process, so they almost have someone lined up when that transition moment occurs? Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, there could be cases, for an example, where a longtime leader is retiring, and the organization could have as much as 2-3 years notice. So their succession plan might be very specific to that event. On the other hand, it is a good idea to have at least a general succession plan living alongside the strategic plan, just in case there is an unexpected change, or an emergency, or just to make sure that it's something that is reviewed and thought about every year.
Right. Because, not every transition, not every departure is expected. And sometimes
Exactly.
the organization can find itself in an emergency posture
Right.
where you're trying to figure
Right.
out who the next leader is. When
Right.
we talk
And
about succession planning, sorry, go ahead. Yep.
No, I was just going to say, even if it is a planned departure, as you said earlier, sometimes it's difficult to talk about or think about things when the leader is still in place, and that's where an interim can be really helpful. For example, it could be a good time to deal with better practices in financial reporting, HR practices, board governance issues. An interim brings expertise and familiarity with those issues and may be able to talk about them and guide the board in ways that an existing executive director may not, because of the different emotional investment. So I would say even a planned departure can often benefit by having an interim between the departure and the bringing on of a new CEO.
Yeah, that brings up an interesting point, that these transitions organizations can think of them as an opportunity to do some strategic planning that happens in tandem with the transition in leadership, and possibly using the presence of an interim executive director as a period to kind of do that analysis.
Exactly. And one of the things that I talk about too is that transition or change, it makes people uncomfortable, and that can create a kind of debris, especially if there's large changes, if there's staff changes, policy changes. And what an interim can do is manage that change, but then they leave, and frankly, we take that debris with us, which really leaves a firmer, cleaner foundation for the next permanent leader to build on.
Right. So that sounds like folks listening to the podcast today, something they should be thinking about when they're thinking about what their succession plan would look like, is whether they want to purposefully build in a kind of transition period with an interim executive director, if they think that their organization could benefit from that kind of period. Yeah.
Yes. Where people are used to thinking of us when there's a perceived emergency, but what we really want people to see is that we also have a very, very positive contribution to bring to the transition, to really leverage the opportunities created, no matter what has created the change.
Totally. So whose responsibility should it be to kind of create the succession plan and to drive this process along? Like, what does that work process look like?
Well, the board is primarily responsible. It's their duty to protect and maintain the sustainability of the organization. But they're also, they hire and manage and supervise the CEO. So when we're talking about managing that succession of the leaders, and maybe not even just the CEO, but if there's a chief COO or a development officer, maybe high level. I think that's the board's responsibility. But I also think it can set a tone for the organization, and that staff can also think about transitioning staff members, and that can lead to conversations about cross-training. Just thinking of sharing of files and folders, uniform procedures. Those things can also be very helpful in an organization going through transition.
Right. Or, as you mentioned earlier, that process of almost taking an inventory of what people's real duties or responsibilities are. I think at nonprofits, things happen so organically, and people fall into different roles and take on different responsibilities for just sort of pragmatic, organic reasons. And we might lose track of who's responsible for what, and when someone leaves, what their responsibilities that need to be taken over are. Yeah,
exactly, and especially in smaller organizations, That happens a lot, but we've also seen that it can be very crippling when someone leaves and it's just not clear what their responsibilities were, what they were doing, who they were talking to. Just like a strategic plan should be constantly referred to and not just stuck up on a shelf, I think a succession plan, too, should be reviewed on an annual basis and make sure that it really still reflects what the organization is doing and what it wants to look forward to.
And it sounds like you'd really need to get the current CEO to have a lot of buy-in in the process, because they're probably the ones who are going to have to be describing what their duties are and envisioning what the transition is going to have to look like. So that's another reason to maybe start this process early, to have it, to have the board kind of have control over this process and to really work collaboratively with the current CEO.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Do we sometimes see a committee of the board handling succession planning, or is there a way to break it down?
It can be, it can be an ad hoc committee, or more and more boards are adopting governance committees, and that also could be a good place for it.
Great. And then, as we're wrapping up, why don't we talk a little bit more about interim executive directors? So if the organization, as part of its succession plan, decides that they want to take on an interim executive director, probably because there isn't an immediate successor in place for a permanent executive director, what kind of work should the board be doing as part of their search for that individual and for bringing that person in?
Well, I think that they want to make sure, first of all, that this is an experienced interim executive director. And that's important because an interim does function differently than an executive director, although all of us do and should have experience as well as an executive director. I think that they should be very clear in their understanding about their expectations from this interim, and understand that they are interim. There are sometimes some organizations that become so comfortable with their interim, they don't understand why they don't, stay permanently. But the real value of the interim is the distance and objectivity we can bring, because we're not on a 6-month job interview. I think because of that, too, though, boards sometimes, if they're comfortable with an interim, will delay the hiring process. And I think that's something that the board has to be very disciplined about, too, because the longer they delay, it's not good for the staff to feel, and funders and donors to feel insecure in the future leadership. Most of our interim engagements last 3 to 9 months.
Okay. Is that time period something that's predefined, or does it sort of evolve depending on depending on whether a new executive director is found within a certain period of time?
Yeah, it tends to evolve. Most professional interims will stay with the organization throughout the transition, because we don't want to put the organization through 2 transitions. So there can be occasions when it can last a little bit longer. It really depends on the organization. In cases where the organization decides to merge or even dissolve, it could be even longer than that, because rather than hiring a permanent CEO, the interim can stay through that. But as a general rule, 3 to 9 months is about our expectation, but it can change with every organization.
It does sound like it would be a good idea to have some sort of deadline hammered out ahead of time to kind of encourage the board to be diligent about their search for the new permanent ED, so that we avoid that issue that you talked about earlier, where the interim's presence kind of slows things down and make people might not be as feel as much pressure to find the next ED.
Exactly.
And should there be a written contract with the interim executive director, and what kind of should be in those agreements?
Yeah, there should be a written agreement. Different interim executive directors approach this differently, and people should be very clear. For example, many of us work on an hourly basis with an hourly fee. Others become just full-time salaried employees. There are some interims who are still working as 1099 consultants. I personally don't believe that's appropriate. I think that we are employees, but that should certainly be clarified. And it's not unusual. For example, my practices, I do have a time limit in my contracts, but they're renewable. But it creates a very graceful opportunity for everyone to look at each other and say, is this still working? And what are our expectations moving forward? So I think that's a good reason to have a time limit, although obviously extended, either party can extend it.
Great. That makes a lot of sense. Well, I think we're coming up on our time. Thank you for joining us today, Barbara. I think a lot of people are going to be walking away from this conversation, if they haven't thought about succession planning yet, walking away with an idea that this is something that might be useful and valuable for their organization to do, and to know that there's some flexibility in how they approach the process, depending on whether they have a planned departure kind of down the line in the future, or if they just want to prepare for a less, a situation with less notice. They should still be thinking about what their next steps would be. So that's really great. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. This is my area of expertise and interest, and I'd really like to see more organizations strengthen themselves with careful and mindful planning. So this is great.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.